talk about who James Buchanan is in this story?
Yeah, I imagine most of your listeners will never have heard of James McGill Buchanan. I hadn't when I started doing the research. And in fact, I wasn't looking for the Kochs or anything about this network. I was trying to understand why it was that some, self-proclaimed free market economists had gotten involved in the Southern schools fight in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education. And they were actually, in race-neutral terms, advocating that some of the program of the most extreme segregationists, and that was Milton Friedman was the first person I was following, and then I got onto this James Buchanan. But when you had, the most arch segregationists calling for shutting down public education to prevent compliance with the Brown decision and having tax dollars go to private schools, suddenly these folks from the University of Chicago, again, Friedman and James Buchanan and Friedman's first doctoral student, a guy named Warren Nutter, they picked up on that and started to push their own agenda using the storm over Brown as kind of wind in their sails for this agenda. And so that just got me really intrigued. And then I started following Buchanan. And then I learned from a Latin Americanist that while many people have heard of the role that Milton Friedman played in advising the Pinochet junta in Chile in the 1970s on inflation, almost no one knew that Buchanan's team, the Virginia School of Political Economy, had also gone over to provide advice and counsel to the dictatorship. So then I picked up that story and learned that Buchanan had helped them shape a constitution that effectively, as the book title says, put democracy in chains. And then I moved to North Carolina in 2010, just as the Tea Party legislature was taking control. And at the time, I was reading Buchanan's ideas, and he just has 20 volumes of collected works. But some of his work is very abstract. But suddenly I saw what my legislature was doing, and I could see that this was Buchanan's thought in action. And then he died in 2013, and I was able to get into his private papers at George Mason, and there the trail was just incontrovertible, that what I was thinking was happening was in fact happening, and the correspondence and other materials there revealed it. And, again, he was a very smart guy. He won the Nobel Prize in economic science in 1986. He developed a new school of political economic thought called public choice economics, sometimes Virginia School of Economics. But he was really, you could say in some ways, the mastermind behind these attacks of the last few decades on government in general and a government that answers to the people in particular. And he provided very shrewd advice for how to undermine that, essentially to how to undermine the form of government that we've experienced over the 20th century, in which you have a more inclusive democracy and the system has to be more responsive to voters. And to do that, it creates programs to address popular needs and desires and taxes people. And they don't like the idea that very wealthy people are being taxed for things that they don't agree with.
But with Buchanan, the idea was more than just about taxes. There were really some fundamental underpinnings. Talk a little bit about that, because I think we make the mistake sometimes of thinking about this only in terms of the taxation aspect.
Yes, thank you very much for saying that, because I really react to that too when I see coverage by, there's been great coverage by journalists. I don't mean to seem critical of it, but I think there's too much emphasis on venality, on the notion that these people are just doing it to line their own pockets or to escape regulation. In fact, this is a whole philosophical system, and it has its own internal ethics. Many of us won't agree with those ethics, but they do have values. And their chief value, they will say, is liberty. When you actually pay closer attention, what they most mean by that is economic liberty, the freedom of property holders to do what they would like to do with their property and to not be subject to taxation for purposes that they don't agree with. But there is a very, very strong commitment that runs through it to this kind of libertarian vision of freedom as the foremost value. And, you can see that now at the forefront of almost all, the big right-wing think tanks, from Cato to Heritage. There's a strong thread of it running through the Federalist Society. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a philosophical system here and a set of values that we need to understand in order to make sense of what's happening.
And talk a little bit about those values, about the underpinnings of Buchanan's ideas.
So he and the folks in the kind of networks that he was part of sometimes like to talk about themselves as classical liberals, and they would draw a line back to Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and others from the late 18th and 19th century. That turns out not to be. And James Madison, of course, there's a lot of mentions of James Madison by this group. But the truth is, for historians and early American historians, if you had them on, could tell you this too, that these folks have really departed in quite significant ways from those traditions. I mean, the classical liberals, Adam Smith, for example, believed that a free market would benefit everyone, right? That in the long term, we'd all be better off. Whereas these guys are very clear in some of their writings that we're going to see starker inequality than we've ever seen before, and that the government is going to have to be very harsh in controlling the inevitable response to that. So I think they have gone farther from that tradition than they believe. And also those classical liberals really supported public education. So there are many differences, but they would certainly say that that's what they're for, and their objection to what liberals and moderates and others want to do is they would say that it's coercive. Why? What right do you have to tax me for a purpose that I don't support? Or to take my hard-earned money and apply it to something else. So they do have a very strong tradition of resisting what they see as illegitimate authority. But it is interesting, I think, that they only see that little illegitimate authority coming from government. So they don't recognize power as operating in the market at all. So the fact that, say, Charles Koch I think he has $46 billion worth of wealth at this point, but that is not seen as a form of power in their system of political economy. So that leads to some real complications when you apply it to the real world.
Ultimately, they believe totally in the market, that everything should be market-driven, it seems.
Yes, but there too you have an interesting difference, and I don't want to take you too far in the weeds on this, but there are many economists, and Milton Friedman was among them, that felt like that believed that the market was the most efficient way of allocating goods, and that would lead to better results for everyone. These folks who come out much more from what's called the Austrian tradition of Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, and Buchanan was kind of a fellow traveler of that. These people think that the market is also the best social decision maker, that we shouldn't be deciding things collectively by democratic process and by majority rule, but instead the market, where we each operate as individual, isolated individuals and make consumer choices, that somehow that's a better way of running society. And they call that coordination, is the, kind of the buzzword that they use. But that's a very different prospect.
Talk a little bit about the ways in which these ideas have become so ingrained in the Republican Party.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that was so interesting when I got into Buchanan's papers at George Mason was finding out that for years his senators, going all the way back to his first one in Virginia, had been doing what they called outreach to public policy makers and decision makers, as well as corporate leaders. So, his team, the Virginia School of Political Economy, was developing these ideas and presenting them in academic circles as a kind of science, that would help us understand politics in a new way. But at the very same time, and in quite different, you could say, cruder terms, they were also doing this outreach to very powerful people in the private sector and in government. And also much of that was partisan. In fact, the whole operation almost blew up at George Mason in 1997 because they were bringing in top decision makers. They had Antonin Scalia, for example, the sitting Supreme Court justice, came in at one point. Clarence Thomas, many people from congressional staffs were getting trained, you could say, in these ideas. And they had free lunches. Milton Friedman always said there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, they would supply free lunches on Capitol Hill, the Mercatus Center that's at George Mason, for once-a-week training of congressional staff. And, of course, they work closely with all the major think tanks on the right. So this message has been getting out for a very long time. It's been been disseminated. But this message comes in a kind of code that outsiders don't know. So that's essentially what I've tried to do in the book, is decode things so that people will understand when they're hearing these words that the words don't mean what those who are outside this cause might think. And I can give you a classic one right now. Donald Trump often talked about draining the swamp. And when liberal, and moderate voters heard that, they thought, well, he's going to end all that corporate lobbying, in Washington and get money out of politics and make it so that, we silence that noise and we can really hear from the citizenry. But actually, when Trump uses that language, he's using the language that comes from Buchanan through these networks. And really what they're talking about by the swamp is the influence that organized groups of citizens have on government, whether it's the labor unions of the AFL-CIO or the civil rights groups or the American Association for Retired People or the women's movement groups, all the citizens groups that make claims on government that require government to spend money either for a program or for some kind of, say, environmental protection. Those are seen as the swamp by these people on the right.